Well, the main aircraft that I flew while I was in the Air Force was the F-4 Phantom. It was a two-person fighter jet. The pilot sat in the front seat, and then in the seat behind him was the weapons systems operator, essentially like a navigator, but he also worked some of the weapons systems. It was supersonic, had two engines. It was quite a cool plane. I mean, it had lots of power. It held speed to climb records during that time frame, and it was used, I think, for almost 50 years.
My career was unusual in the way that I actually was flying as I started my flying career after pilot training, after I trained in these T-38 airplanes, I flew the C-141 Starlifter, which is a 300,000-pound four-engine jet transport, and I was able to fly that airplane continuously for 32 years, which is a little unusual, and I got to take it all over the world and be involved in a lot of wonderful things, and it was a great life.
During my Air Force career in pilot training, I would fly the T-41, the T-37, and then the supersonic T-38. My first assignment was flying C-141s built by Lockheed, which is a four-engine cargo jet capable of flying around the world, typically a crew of 4 to 5. And then I also had the opportunity to fly the airplane you see behind me here, which is a C-130, also built by Lockheed. Again, a 4 to 5 person crew. This has propellers, so it would go at slower speeds, much more of a tactical airplane than a long-range airlift airplane.
I worked in two areas. One was in the billeting area, which is basically housing of all personnel, and the other was in the radiological monitoring team, and that team of people was responsible for investigating any type of nuclear accident, be it deliberate or accidental, associated with a nuclear explosion or a nuclear accident on the base that I was assigned to.
Well, the training, everyone in the Air Force gets an extensive training that's well documented trained by people that have done the job before. My specific job as a pilot required me to do an initial screening in a light propeller airplane called the T-41, which is similar to a Cessna 172. And then you go through a one-year period of what they call undergraduate pilot training, which involves training in two different types of jet aircraft. And successful completion of that course allows you to be rewarded your pilot wings in this particular program I was in. And then you were sent off to further training in the first aircraft you were going to fly in your mission, in your line unit, they call it. And that probably requires anything from another 3 to 6 months of training. And then generally when you arrive at your unit, you will have 1 or 2 years of kind of on-the-job training. So it's an extensive program, but very well done.
The training was encompassed several hours or days, and in some cases weeks, of understanding the various levels of radiation associated with what type of radiation provided the most harm or exposure to human individuals.
Training when I was in the Ohio Air National Guard consisted of regular basic Air Force basic training at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas. And then I went to Biloxi, Mississippi, to Keesler Air Force Base for training in communications, which is called technical control. That was the division I was in. And we were there for 7 months, a total of 9 months of training on active duty, prior to going and finishing the remainder of the 6 years with the Ohio Air National Guard.
It was 6 months of it in Amarillo, Texas. And I enjoyed it. That was something different for a little country boy. And I really did enjoy it. After that, I went to Europe for 38 months.
Training in pilot training is very demanding. It's a year-long program. Typically what would happen is you would have 17 different academic exams, another dozen flight exams or evaluations. A very demanding program. I went through the pilot training at the height of Vietnam in 67 and 68, and during that time we still had a 50% washout rate. So every other pilot never had a chance to finish pilot training. I was fortunate. I learned how to study harder in pilot training than I ever did before or afterwards. Again, very demanding program, only the best get through.
Air Force pilot training is in a couple of phases. First, you do what's called UPT, undergraduate pilot training. During that time, you start out in essentially a Cessna C-172, which is also known as a T-41, a single-engine, propeller-driven aircraft. And you fly that for 15 or 18 hours, I think. You learn basic flying skills, how to take off, how to land, how to do an inspection. Then you do solo time in it. And so that's your first step into the process of becoming a pilot. And then you go to, at least during that time when I was in, you flew a T-37, which was a twin-engine jet aircraft, where you sat next to the instructor. So you would be in the right seat, and the instructor was in the left-hand seat. And you flew that for probably 100 hours plus or minus. Learned everything from safety to basic flying skills, takeoff landings, formation flying. And then you graduated from that into the T-38, which is a supersonic high-performance trainer aircraft, which you flew tandem, the student in the front and the instructor in the rear. And you flew everything in that. I mean, takeoff landings, formations, nighttime flying. We did cross-country, so multiple state kind of missions. And then from there, you essentially get into your final assignment training-wise on what aircraft are you going to be assigned. I had wanted to be a fighter pilot, so my selection was just to go into fighter planes in general, and I was selected for F-4 school. The F-4 school that I went to was at MacDill Air Base in Tampa, Florida. You learned everything about the aircraft, how to maneuver it, how to handle it. Probably incorporated 200 hours of flying time. Takeoffs, landings, formations, air-to-air refueling, trips to the gunnery range, air-to-air combat maneuvering. It was pretty exciting stuff. It was lots of fun. I had moments of being a little nervous, but you learn how to handle the situation. So that's what the training was like in undergraduate pilot and also F-4 school.
Well, in my career, I was able to be assigned at several places. I actually was able to, my first military assignment was at the Air Force Academy where I attended. And then I attended pilot training in Craig Air Force Base, which is in Selma, Alabama. That's the first time I had ever lived in that part of the country. I was trained further in Oklahoma. And then I spent a lot of my career at McChord Air Force Base, which is in western Washington, near Seattle. Spent time at Travis Air Force Base in California, and was fortunate enough to end my career here at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
I was assigned, first of all, my basic training was at Lackland Air Force Base just outside of San Antonio, Texas. And the base I was assigned to from there was a base just outside of Boston, Massachusetts called L.G. Hanscom Field, which is today called Hanscom Air Force Base.
I was at Tinker Air Force Base. Did C-141s and 124s, Vietnam, RF-4Cs, RF-101s, RB-57s, and T-39s. Then I went to Dover, had 141s, 133s, and 124s there. Then I went to SAC, Grissom Air Force Base in Indiana, 135s, B-52s, and T-33 chase planes. We used to chase 58s that had problems. Then I went to McChord Air Force Base, Washington, 141s. And eventually we got 130s in. Then Korea, F4s, B models. Then I came here to Wright-Pat, test wing. We had various aircraft, 135s, DC-135s, 130s, T-29s, and that's about aircraft we had here, and then I retired.
As far as locations or bases that I was at during my Air Force career, I started at Officers Training School at Lackland Air Base in San Antonio, Texas. And from there I went to pilot training at Moody Air Base in Valdosta, Georgia. And from there I went to F4 school at MacDill Air Base in Tampa, Florida. And then my first and essentially last F4 school or F4 base was Torrejon Air Base, Spain. While I was there, I did temporary assignments at Incirlik Air Base in Turkey and also at Aviano Air Base in Italy. So I some time in Europe, but most of it was spent here in the U.S.
I was at Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi. I was at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, San Antonio, Texas. And then my home base was at the Springfield Airport, an Air National Guard base in Springfield, Ohio. And from there, we would drill 1 weekend a month, and then 2 weeks in the summer. And those 2 weeks in the summer were at bases all over the country, sometimes in Indiana, Seymour Air Force Base, sometimes at Wisconsin, at Volk Field.
I started my pilot training career at Williams Air Force Base in Phoenix, Arizona, as a young learning how to fly. And then my next assignment was at Travis in the San Francisco Bay Area. Most of my time there was spent flying combat missions to Vietnam. My next assignment for 14 years was at McChord near Seattle, Washington, where most of what we would fly was to Alaska and Korea. And assignments after that, New Jersey, New York, Atlanta, Milwaukee. And my last assignment was here at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio, where I had a chance to command the C-141 wing, the only airplanes we have at Wright-Patterson, and the last C-141s before they were all retired.
When people have asked, what part did I like the best about flying F4s? I think the sheer power. You could feel, you would be strapped in to the seat, and you've got your helmet on, you've got an oxygen mask on, and you were kind of one with the aircraft. So you could just feel the power when you push the throttles for takeoff into the full afterburner. You could feel it, and that was the coolest part. It was just wow. It was definitely a wow sensation. I mean, it was fun.
Well, my favorite part of the aircraft, one of the missions we performed was working with the United States Army and other services that drop paratroopers out of planes for whatever reason. And that was to fly what we call the airdrop mission, which involved being able to fly low level and fly in formation. And it took a lot of, in this age of computers and other type of things, that still involved a lot of just pilotage skills and seat of the pants flying, and I enjoyed that a lot.
That's an excellent question. You do get tired. We try to manage the crew all the time so that typically if you're flying at night, we would try to have one of the pilots would have a chance to nap while the other pilot would be primarily doing controls. But typically you'd be napping in the seats. So if emergency would come up, all you had to do was tap the guy on the shoulder and he'd be instantly awake. So it was an operation kind of like a firefighter where you were supposed to be sleeping, but you had to instantly wake up and be ready for any action that would occur.
Well, that was a constant challenge, especially in the line of work I was in. We tried to help each other out by, we were fortunate to have an airplane that had multiple crew members, including at least 2 pilots. On lengthier missions, we actually would fly with 3 pilots, and we would then have an opportunity to try to get some rest. But it is a constant battle. We try to keep each other alert on the crew and make it a team effort. But it was many times, yes, I felt like I was going to fall asleep.
As far as getting back to the flying for a long period of time, I think my longest flight was flying from Torrejon to Aviano, Italy. Because of the geographic and the flying from Italy would have been the eastern coast of Italy up by Venice is where Aviano is located, back to Torrejon, which is right outside of Madrid, Spain. You had to avoid flying over France. They did not allow U.S. aircraft to fly, military aircraft to fly into their airspace. So it was probably this is thinking back a long time, it was probably a 4.5, maybe a 5-hour flight. It involved one air-to-air refueling, but it's just like doing your job. So I mean, it was no big deal. And we typically flew in rather open four aircraft formations, so you had a lot of space in between the aircraft, and it made it relatively easy. You kind of looked out for each another and carried on conversations, so time went rather quickly. People have asked about, what's it like to fly for a long period of time? And because when you fly on a commercial airline, and if it's more than a couple hours, a lot of people sit in their seat and nod off. When you're a pilot in a two-man aircraft and you're the guy in charge, there's enough going on, and even though you have autopilot and you can set it up so that it pretty much maintained altitude, you still had to be attentive to the gauges and the engines and navigational situation. So you were really never more than moments in between having to change something, having to monitor something, having to do radio communications with your flight partners. Also, if it was a flight for more than about 2 hours, you had to have a in-air refueling situation, which were very intense. Your concentration level during that time was 100%, because maneuvering underneath a in-flight tanker KC-135 was took all your concentration and efforts. So long flights are in a two-man fighter jet are nowhere near like a long flight in a commercial aircraft.
The longest flight I made, I think, was 16 hours. It involved a flight from Pacific Northwest to Egypt, and we did have to do 2 in-flight refuelings where we had to take on extra fuel and flight to allow us to get our load to the mission, or to the mission load to Egypt. And I've had several flights of 14 hours, I believe.
Well, my longest flight is, in terms of hours being on the road, was probably about 24 hours. But we had several stops on that flight. The longest continuous flight in flight would be probably about 15 hours, during which course in the middle of that flight I had to do an air refueling operation to give us enough fuel to get to the destination.
When people have asked, well, you like the acceleration and the power feeling the most, what was your least favorite part? And I have to say that maybe the maneuvering with a large load of I was in more of a training situation for most of my pilot time. So with a large load of weapons on the aircraft, maneuvering at high altitude was always a challenge. The plane was not as nimble. It took more power. It just was a different feel. It was kind of like flying instead of driving a race car, you were driving a semi-truck. So it was just a total different feeling, and you had to be much more attentive to everything about you. Nighttime refueling like that was a serious challenge. So, but it's part of the job, and you learn how to do it. And when I think back, that was exciting too. But it was not my favorite part.
I think the hardest part of the job was the unusual hours you'd have to work. You might be getting up at 10 o'clock at night and then flying all night long, landing at noon, and then the schedule was never the same. Plus, typically in our airplane, you'd cross half a dozen time zone changes, so your body was always messed up. So that was the hardest part of the job, is just adjusting to the many changes of the lifestyle.
Well, the least favorite part is we were probably gone from home for long periods of time, and that's always difficult to do. And the family members do help on in that, and probably flew in a lot of kind of long hours, and frequently required us to fly overnight, and sometimes it was a little difficult getting sleep, but it was worth the effort.
It depends on what you had to do. If you had to pull the engine out, it was kind of hard to do, and then you had some systems that's in the engine bay over the top of the engine, fire loops and stuff like that, weapons to drop the drop tanks. If they had trouble with that, we had to pull the engine out so they could troubleshoot the circuit.
During the time that I was at Torrejon, we really were not in any combat situations. However, we did sit alert for potential Cold War situations where you would essentially be ready to take off and hit targets if the situation ever arose. Thank God it never did. We also trained for combat missions. So they were mostly simulated combat situations where you would fly missions against a target at a target range or something like this. So it was more simulated combat situations, not actual physical combat that I was involved in.
I participated in 3 combat zones. During Vietnam, I spent 44 months in a row flying in-country, whether it was Vietnam into Thailand. And the nature of the mission we had was primarily carrying cargo in and then flying medical evacuation flights out, bringing the wounded or perhaps sometimes deceased personnel back home. The closest I ever actually came to any action was the parking spot I was sitting on in Saigon was hit by a mortar, but the mortar shell landed 3 hours after I left. So I was actually 1,000 miles away. It's just a matter of timing. The other operations in Bosnia, very little operations there. In flying the C-130s in Desert Storm, I was due to land in Dahran with a Scud missile coming in at the same time. We decided to hold and wait for the Scud to hit. But I can say very happily that I was never involved in any combat action, either offensively or defensively.
Having flown the F-4, there were some other aircraft that were, especially ones that were just coming out about the time I was getting out of the Air Force, and the F-16 was just coming out. In fact, we saw a demo flight of an F-4 essentially versus an F-16, and the flight maneuvering difference was huge. The F-16 was like the ultimate Formula One sports car. I mean, it was just the maneuverability on it versus an F-4 was night and day difference. It would have been fun to have flown something more maneuverable. The other aircraft that I had always thought would have been cool to fly was an F-106, Delta Wing Interceptor, I think is what they were classified as. They were used in the Air Defense Command to defend the U.S. against foreign aircraft invasion type of tactics. And that was actually my very first choice coming out of pilot training, but there was none available at that time, so I got into the F-4, which believe me was very exciting. But yeah, the F-106 or the F-16 would have been very cool.
There's a lot of different airplanes that I wouldn't mind flying. Everything from the C-5s to the 747s. But what I enjoyed doing was the airplane I spent most of my time in. And it was the mission that was more important, where you went and what the nature of what you were doing. And the airplane, in a lot of cases, was the byproduct.
Well, you always like to have a little variety. I'm pretty happy with what I was able to do, really. I would like to have flown the C-17 Goldmaster III that's in the inventory now, but I was leaving the service just a little too late to be able to cross-train into that airplane.
Oh, I think I enjoyed myself as I look back on it today. My term of service was from 1960 to 1966, and that was 4 years of active duty and 2 years of the reserve.
I did not see anything else that I would rather do more. It was exciting. We had excitement. There was something happening all the time. There were many times when I had 4 telephones, one at each ear and one hanging on each shoulder, talking to 4 different locations while we worked to solve problems. And it was exciting to be able to keep the communications lines open for the Air Force and for all the different outfits.
I enjoyed flying the airplanes. It was a chance to basically take off and go someplace different all the time. And I actually preferred flying. The disadvantage of an Air Force career is that typically you're rotating through a lot of staff jobs in the Pentagon. I elected after my first 5 years of active duty to join the reserves. In the reserves, you just fly the airplanes, and so I ended up eventually managing reserve programs. And so I very happily say that I was got 13,000 hours of flying military airplanes, and every assignment I had was a flying position. So it was a fun job to have.
I enjoyed that very much, and I don't think that I could think of anything I would have rather done while I was in the Air Force.
Being in the Air Force was extremely rewarding. It was an opportunity to serve my country. It was an opportunity to get the advanced training and meet a lot of great people and go a lot of great places. Just something that was just beyond recognition. Just outstanding.